The rain fell in relentless sheets, soaking the bustling streets of downtown Chicago. Chase Carter adjusted the lapel of his tailored suit as he stepped out of his sleek black car. The world knew him as a self-made millionaire, a man who had risen from the chaos of his youth to build an empire in real estate. But tonight, under the flickering streetlights, his focus wasn't on closing deals or schmoozing with board members. Instead, his mind was preoccupied with the meeting that had just ended, an offer to partner with an organization claiming to champion housing for the underprivileged. Chase had seen the numbers, the hidden fine print. It was just another scheme to exploit the vulnerable. He sighed deeply, walking toward a nearby cafe to clear his head. That's when he saw them. Two small figures huddled under the awning of a closed storefront. The neon glow of the surrounding signs illuminated their frail bodies. Two girls, no older than 10, wrapped in tattered blankets. They clung to each other for warmth, their oversized backpacks serving as makeshift pillows. Chase hesitated. Homelessness was a harsh reality he'd seen before, but tried to keep at arm's length. Still, something about these girls tugged at him. Their curly hair, the curve of their noses, even the determined way they sat close together. It felt familiar. He shook his head. It was probably just his imagination. The girls must have felt his gaze because one of them turned her head and met his eyes. Her wide, almond-shaped eyes locked onto his, filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. It wasn't the typical look of someone expecting pity or a handout. No, this was different. It was as if she was sizing him up, trying to decide if he was trustworthy. "Can I help you?" Chase asked, his voice soft but firm, careful not to startle them. The older girl nudged her sibling, who shifted nervously but didn't speak. Finally, the older one replied, "No, sir. We're fine." Her voice was steady, but her shivering betrayed her. "You don't look fine," Chase said, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "Where are your parents?" The question hung in the air like the rain clinging to the city. The younger girl looked down at her shoes, biting her lip, while the older one squared her shoulders. "We don't got parents," she said plainly. The words hit Chase harder than he expected. He straightened up, unsure of what to say next. As he glanced down, the neon light caught the younger girl's face just right. His heart stopped. Those eyes, they weren't just familiar, they were identical to his own. Before he could speak, the older girl leaned forward slightly, narrowing her eyes at him as if studying his face for confirmation. Then, with a voice barely louder than a whisper, she asked, "Daddy?" The word cut through Chase like a lightning bolt. He stumbled back, gripping the edge of the awning for support. "What did you say?" "You're him, aren't you?" The girl pressed, her voice gaining strength. "You're our dad." Chase's mind raced. This had to be a mistake, some kind of cruel misunderstanding. But the way they looked at him, the hope, the desperation, it was impossible to ignore. I don't think," he started, but the younger girl interrupted him, her voice trembling but resolute. "Mom said you'd come back for us," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "She said we just had to wait." Chase's chest tightened as the weight of their words began to sink in. Could this be true? Had his past come back in a way he could never have imagined? He didn't know these girls, or did he? Memories he thought he'd buried years ago began to surface, hazy and incomplete. Before he could ask another question, the older girl grabbed her sister's hand. "We'll leave if you want us to," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "But you should know, Mom's gone. It's just us now." Chase opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling, and the rain was washing away the carefully constructed walls of his life. Suddenly, a loud horn blared from a passing car, snapping him back to the present. The girls flinched at the noise, their small frames trembling from the cold. Chase took a deep breath, his instincts as a businessman screaming at him to walk away, to avoid the entanglement of this messy, emotional situation. But another part of him, the part he thought he'd lost long ago, urged him to stay. "Wait," he said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. He crouched down again, looking the older girl in the eye. "Let's start over. My name is Chase Carter. What's yours?" She hesitated, then answered, "Rose. And this is my sister, Lisa." Rose and Lisa, Chase repeated, nodding slowly. Okay, let's figure this out together. As the rain continued to pour, Chase made a decision that would change everything. He didn't know the full story yet, but one thing was clear. These girls weren't going anywhere without him. Chase led the girls into the cafe, the warm glow of its lights casting away the chill of the rain. He wasn't sure what he was doing. Every logical part of him screamed that he should call the authorities or at least take them to a shelter. But something stronger, something he couldn't explain, told him to stay. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air. Lys's eyes lit up as they landed on the display of baked goods behind the counter. Rose tugged her sister's hand, holding her back. It's okay, Chase said, noticing the hesitation. You can order whatever you want. The girls exchanged a glance. Rose seemed wary, but Lisa's hunger won out. Chase ordered a hot chocolate for each of them and 2 sandwiches, watching as they devoured the food like they hadn't eaten in days. He studied them closely, searching for clues in their faces. Rose's sharp cheekbones and determined eyes reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. Lisa's softer features mirrored his own childhood photos almost exactly. It was uncanny. So, he said cautiously as they finished eating, can you tell me more about your mom? What happened to her? Rose stiffened, her protective instincts kicking in. She leaned slightly in front of Lisa, shielding her as if Chase might suddenly turn on them. She's gone, Rose said flatly. That's all you need to know. Gone where? Chase pressed, his voice gentle but firm. Rose hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Finally, she said, she got sick. We tried to help her, but there was nothing we could do. Lisa's eyes welled with tears, and Chase's chest tightened at the sight. The pain in their voices was too real, too raw to be part of some elaborate scam. I'm sorry, Chase said softly. That must have been really hard for you both. It was, Rose replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But we're fine. We don't need anyone's help. Her words were defiant, but Chase could see through the bravado. They were just kids, alone in a world that had shown them nothing but hardship. And then there was the other question, the one that loomed over everything. Why do you think I'm your dad? He asked, his voice careful. Lisa wiped her nose on her sleeve, looking at Rose as if for permission to speak. Rose nodded reluctantly. Mom used to talk about you, Lisa said. She said you were smart and strong, and that someday you'd come back for us. Chase felt a lump rise in his throat. He couldn't deny that their words stirred something deep inside him, memories of a life he tried to leave behind. He thought back to his younger days, before the suits and the skyscrapers, back when he was just another kid in the projects, struggling to survive. There had been a girl, Tasha. They'd grown up together, inseparable for years. She was smart, kind, and fiercely independent. They dreamed of escaping the cycle of poverty together, but life had pulled them in different directions. Chase had left to chase his ambitions, and Tasha, well, he'd never really looked back. Could it be her? He shook his head, trying to focus. It had been over a decade, and even if it was, how could these girls be his? He would have known, wouldn't he? Your mom, Chase began, his voice unsteady. What was her name? Tasha, Rose said, her eyes narrowing as she watched his reaction. Tasha Williams. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. It was her. The memories came flooding back, her laugh, her determination, the way she'd always pushed him to be better. He'd never imagined she might have been raising his children all these years. I knew her, Chase admitted, his voice barely audible. A long time ago. Rose crossed her arms, her expression hardening. Then you left her, she said bluntly. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. Chase didn't know how to respond. Was she right? Had he abandoned them without even realizing it? I didn't know, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. If I had. It doesn't matter, Rose cut him off. You weren't there. We don't need you now. Her words stung, but Chase could see the fear beneath her anger. She was just a child, forced to take on the role of a parent far too soon. You're right, he said softly. I wasn't there, and I can't change that. But I'm here now, and I want to help if you'll let me. Rose looked away, her jaw clenched. Lisa reached out and touched her sister's arm. Maybe we should trust him, she whispered. Chase's heart ached as he watched them. He wanted to tell them everything would be okay, but he knew it wasn't that simple. There were still so many unanswered questions. Do you have anywhere to stay tonight? He asked. Rose hesitated, then shook her head. Then you'll come with me, Chase said, making the decision before he could second-guess himself. Rose looked at him sharply. We don't need your charity. It's not charity, Chase replied. It's a place to sleep and a warm meal. Just for tonight. After that, you can decide what you want to do. Rose studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. The ride to Chase's penthouse was silent, the hum of the car engine the only sound. Lisa dozed off against her sister's shoulder, her small face peaceful for the first time that night. Chase watched them through the rearview mirror, his mind racing. As they pulled into the underground parking garage, Chase felt a pang of uncertainty. What was he doing? He was a businessman, not a father. He barely had time for himself, let alone 2 children. But as he glanced back at their sleeping faces, he knew he couldn't turn his back on them. Not now, not ever. When they stepped into the elevator, Lisa blinked awake, her eyes wide as she took in the sleek, modern design. Is this where you live? She asked, her voice filled with wonder. Chase nodded. It's home. The doors slid open to reveal his sprawling penthouse, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The girls stepped inside hesitantly, their eyes darting around the luxurious space. It's big, Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rose stayed silent, her expression guarded. You can take the guest room, Chase said, leading them down the hallway. He opened the door to reveal a cozy room with twin beds and a soft, inviting glow from the bedside lamps. Lisa climbed onto one of the beds, her small body sinking into the plush mattress. It's so soft, she murmured, her voice filled with awe. Rose stayed by the door, her arms crossed. We're not staying forever, she said firmly. Of course not, Chase replied, his tone gentle. Just for tonight. As he watched them settle in, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The questions still lingered. About Tasha, about the girls, about the truth of their connection. But one thing was certain. He couldn't walk away now. Whether or not he was their father, he owed them a chance at something better. And for the first time in years, Chase Carter felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Chase couldn't sleep. The city lights outside his window sparkled like stars, but his mind was far from peaceful. He sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through old photos on his phone, trying to find something, anything, that could connect the dots. Tasha's face filled his mind, unbidden. He remembered her as she'd been back then, bold and full of fire, always ready to challenge the world. If she'd been raising 2 daughters on her own, how hard had it been for her? And why hadn't she reached out? He couldn't shake the guilt that clung to him, like he failed her in a way he didn't even understand. In the guest room, Rose sat upright in the dark, her knees pulled to her chest. She didn't trust him. People like him didn't care about girls like her and Lisa, kids who'd been left to fend for themselves. She'd heard stories about men like Chase, men who thought they could throw money at a problem and make it go away. Lisa stirred in the bed next to her, mumbling something in her sleep. Rose reached out and smoothed her sister's hair, her heart aching. She couldn't let Lisa get her hopes up. Whatever Chase Carter wanted, it wasn't them. People like him didn't stick around. The next morning, the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the penthouse. Chase was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes, a rare domestic moment for a man who usually relied on takeout and catered meals. Lisa wandered in first, rubbing her eyes. She stopped short when she saw the spread on the counter. You made this? She asked, her voice full of disbelief. Chase chuckled. Don't look so surprised. I'm not totally useless in the kitchen. Rose appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. She surveyed the scene with suspicion. Why are you doing this? She asked bluntly. Doing what? Chase replied, plating a stack of pancakes. This, Rose said, gesturing to the table. The food, the bed, all of it. What do you want from us? Chase set the plate down and looked her in the eye. I don't want anything, he said. I just want to help. Rose's gaze didn't waver. People don't help for no reason. He sighed, realizing she wasn't going to be easily convinced. Maybe I'm trying to make up for lost time, he admitted. If there's even a chance that you're my daughters, I want to do right by you. Lisa looked up from her plate, her eyes wide. Do you think we are? She asked softly. Chase hesitated. I don't know, he said honestly, but I'm going to find out. After breakfast, Chase made a few phone calls. He arranged for a paternity test, but it would take a few days to get the results. In the meantime, he needed to figure out how to keep the girls safe and comfortable without overwhelming them. As the day went on, little pieces of their lives began to unfold. Lisa was eager to talk, sharing snippets of memories about their mom. How she'd sing to them when they were scared, how she'd always find a way to make them laugh, even when things were tough. Rose, on the other hand, stayed quiet. She answered questions with as few words as possible, her walls firmly in place. But Chase noticed the way she watched him, her sharp eyes taking in every move he made, as if she were constantly assessing whether he was trustworthy. That evening, Chase sat in his office, staring at the results of a background check he'd requested on Tasha. The report confirmed what the girls had said. Tasha had passed away a few months ago from a sudden illness. There was no mention of other family members or close friends. It seemed the girls really had been on their own. But there was something else that caught his attention, a name that appeared repeatedly in the report. Marcus Cain. Chase didn't recognize it, but the man seemed to have been involved in Tasha's life in some capacity. A former landlord? An acquaintance? The details were murky, but the name nagged at him. When Chase brought it up casually at dinner, Rose's fork clattered against her plate. What did you say? She asked, her voice sharp. Marcus Cain, Chase repeated. Do you know him? Rose's face darkened, and she looked away. Lisa froze, her expression anxious. Who is he? Chase pressed gently. No one, Rose said quickly. He's no one. But the tension in the room told Chase otherwise. Whoever Marcus Cain was, the girls knew him, and they didn't trust him. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Chase sat in the living room, his thoughts racing. There was more to this story than he'd realized. Marcus Cain was a piece of the puzzle, but how did he fit? And why did the girls react so strongly to his name? As the rain pattered against the windows, Chase couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The pieces were there, but they weren't fitting together yet. In the quiet of the penthouse, Rose lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She hated that Chase had mentioned Marcus. It brought back memories she tried to bury, memories of dark nights and whispered threats, of a man who had made their lives even harder after their mom had passed. She couldn't let him find them. Not again. The tension in the air was thick, unspoken but undeniable. Chase didn't know it yet, but he was stepping into something far bigger than he bargained for. And as the days stretched on, the truth would only become harder to uncover and harder to face. The following morning, Chase was restless. He couldn't shake the name Marcus Cain from his thoughts, nor could he ignore Rose's reaction. Something about it felt heavier than he had anticipated, like he was stirring up a part of their lives they desperately wanted to leave behind. He glanced at his phone, debating whether to dig deeper or let it go. The tension in his gut told him he needed answers. Lisa wandered into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. Morning, she mumbled, her voice still thick with sleep. Morning, kiddo, Chase replied, handing her a glass of orange juice. She hesitated, studying his face. You look worried, she said cautiously. I've just got a lot on my mind, Chase admitted. He thought about asking her about Marcus, but decided against it. Lisa was too open, too vulnerable. He didn't want to push her into saying something she wasn't ready to share. When Rose appeared a few minutes later, her expression was guarded as usual. She barely glanced at Chase before sitting at the table, her posture stiff. I was thinking we could do something fun today, Chase said, trying to ease the tension. Maybe head to the park or catch a movie. Rose shot him a skeptical look. Why are you pretending everything's normal? Because, Chase said, leaning forward, sometimes normal is the only thing that keeps us sane. She didn't respond, but her eyes softened just a fraction. Lisa, however, lit up at the idea of going out. By afternoon, they were at the park. Lisa ran ahead, chasing a squirrel, her laughter filling the air. Chase watched her, smiling, but his attention kept drifting back to Rose, who lingered by a bench, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Why don't you join her?" Chase asked, gesturing toward Lisa. "I'm fine here," Rose replied curtly. He sat down beside her, sensing she needed space, but also knowing she wouldn't push him away entirely. "You know," he said after a moment, "I get the feeling you're used to carrying a lot on your shoulders." Rose glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you remind me of myself when I was your age," Chase said. "I had to grow up fast, too." She didn't respond, but he saw the faintest flicker of understanding in her expression. Before he could say more, Lisa came bounding back, her cheeks flushed from running. "Can we get ice cream?" she asked breathlessly. Chase laughed. "You don't have to ask me twice." The afternoon passed in relative peace, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Chase could feel it, like a storm brewing just out of sight. That night, as the city buzzed outside, Chase sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. He'd been researching Marcus Cain for hours, piecing together bits of information. The man had a criminal record, nothing major, but enough to raise red flags. He'd been connected to various shady dealings, including a string of evictions and disputes in low-income neighborhoods. And then there was the photo. Chase's breath caught as he stared at the grainy image of Marcus Cain standing outside a rundown apartment building. Beside him, barely recognizable, was Tasha. The timestamp on the photo was from 2 years ago. Chase's mind raced. What had Tasha been doing with Marcus Cain? And why had she kept the girls so far away from him? The questions piled up, each one heavier than the last. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Rose standing in the doorway, her face pale. "You're looking into him, aren't you?" she said, her voice trembling. Chase nodded slowly. "I need to understand what's going on, Rose. I need to protect you and Lisa." Rose's fists clenched at her sides. "You don't know what you're getting into," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then help me understand," Chase urged. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "He's dangerous," she said finally. "He hurt our mom. He threatened us." Chase's chest tightened. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I didn't think you believed me," Rose said bitterly. "Guys like you, rich, powerful, you don't live in the same world as us." "I'm not him, Rose," Chase said firmly. "I'm not Marcus Cain." She stared at him, her defenses wavering. "If he finds out we're here—" "He won't," Chase interrupted. "I won't let him." But even as he said the words, a sliver of doubt crept in. Marcus Cain wasn't just a ghost from their past. He was a threat, a real, tangible danger. And if Rose was right, he wouldn't stop until he found them. The weight of the situation settled over Chase like a heavy blanket. The girls weren't just two kids in need of help. They were in hiding, running from a man who had the power to destroy everything. As the night stretched on, Chase couldn't sleep. He stood by the window, watching the city below, his mind racing. He'd spent his life building walls around himself, keeping people at arm's length. But now, with Rose and Lisa under his roof, those walls were starting to crack. And for the first time, Chase felt truly vulnerable, not for himself, but for the two girls who had turned his world upside down. The next morning, Chase awoke with a sense of unease that only deepened as the day went on. Rose had withdrawn even more, barely touching her breakfast, while Lisa tried to fill the silence with chatter about her favorite cartoons. Chase listened, but his thoughts were elsewhere, circling back to the ominous presence of Marcus Cain and the photo that seemed to tie him to Tasha's past. By midday, Chase decided it was time to confront Rose again. He found her sitting on the small balcony, knees drawn up to her chest as she stared out over the city. "Rose," he began gently, "I need you to tell me everything about Marcus. I can't protect you if I don't know what I'm up against." She didn't turn to look at him. Instead, her voice came low and steady, as though she'd rehearsed the words 100 times in her mind. "He wasn't always bad," she said. "At least, not in the beginning. He and Mom, they had something once, but it changed. He started doing things, illegal things, and when Mom tried to leave, he made sure she couldn't. Chase's jaw tightened. He could hear the pain in her voice, the weight of memories she wasn't ready to share in full. Why didn't she go to the police? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. Rose let out a bitter laugh. You think someone like Marcus is afraid of the police? He has connections, people who cover for him, people who make problems disappear. Chase felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a man with a shady past. Marcus Cain was a predator, someone who thrived on fear and control. But before Chase could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. He hesitated, then picked it up. The number was unknown, but something compelled him to answer. Hello, he said cautiously. A low, gravelly voice came through the line. Mr. Blackwell, I hear you've been asking questions about me. Chase's blood turned cold. Who is this? The voice chuckled darkly. Let's not play games. You know who I am. And you should know that sticking your nose where it doesn't belong is a dangerous habit. Chase's hand tightened around the phone. If you think you can threaten me, I don't need to threaten you, Marcus interrupted. But I suggest you enjoy the time you have with those girls. It won't last long. The line went dead. Chase stared at the phone, his heart pounding. Rose turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. Was that him? Chase nodded, his mind racing. If Marcus had found out about his involvement, it meant he was closer than Chase had anticipated. Pack a bag, Chase said suddenly, his voice firm. Both of you. We're leaving. Rose stood, panic flashing across her face. What? Where are we going? Somewhere safe, Chase replied. I'm not taking any chances. The next hour was a blur of activity. Chase moved through the apartment with purpose, grabbing essentials and making calls to arrange a safe house through one of his trusted contacts. Rose and Lisa followed his instructions without question, though the tension in the air was palpable. As they piled into Chase's car, Lisa looked up at him with wide, worried eyes. Are we in trouble? She asked softly. Chase forced a reassuring smile. No, sweetheart, I just want to make sure you're safe. But as he drove through the city, Chase couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every car that lingered too long behind him, every pedestrian who seemed to glance in their direction. It all felt like part of a larger threat closing in. They arrived at the safe house just before sunset. It was a modest cabin tucked away in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the city. Chase's contact had assured him it was secure, but the weight of Marcus's warning lingered in his mind. As the girls settled in, Chase stepped outside to make another call. He needed more information, more leverage. If Marcus thought he could intimidate him, he was wrong. Chase wasn't the type to back down, especially when the stakes were this high. But as he dialed, the faint sound of footsteps behind him made him freeze. He turned quickly, expecting to see Rose or Lisa, but there was no one there. The woods around the cabin were silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Chase's eyes scanned the shadows, his instincts on high alert. He knew better than to dismiss the feeling. Marcus wasn't the kind of man to issue empty threats. When he returned inside, Rose was waiting for him, her arms crossed. You think this place will keep him out? She asked, her tone skeptical. It's a start, Chase replied, and I have people watching. If he makes a move, we'll know. Rose didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. Instead, she sat down beside Lisa, who had fallen asleep on the couch, clutching a worn stuffed animal. As Chase watched them, the enormity of the situation hit him. This wasn't just about protecting Rose and Lisa anymore. It was about confronting the demons of their past, the ones that had been chasing them for far too long. And as the night deepened, Chase knew one thing for certain. Marcus Cain wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. But neither would Chase. The tension in the cabin was thick, and the hours crept by. Chase sat by the window, his eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves put him on edge. Inside, Rose hovered near Lisa, keeping a protective arm around her sister as the little girl slept soundly, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking just beyond their sanctuary. Chase's phone vibrated softly on the table, and he snatched it up immediately. It was a message from his contact. ***, movement reported near the perimeter. Stay inside. Backup is en route. ***. He read it twice, his heart pounding. Backup wasn't supposed to be necessary. This place was supposed to be hidden, off the radar. But Marcus had found them, just like Chase feared he would. Rose must have seen the look on his face because she stood abruptly. "He's here, isn't he?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Chase nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Stay with Lisa. Don't leave her side." Rose hesitated, her eyes searching his face for reassurance he couldn't fully give. Then she nodded, pulling Lisa closer. Chase grabbed the small handgun he had brought with him. He wasn't the kind of man who turned to violence easily, but this was different. This was about survival. The first sign of Marcus's men came with a distant crunch of boots on gravel. Chase extinguished the lights in the cabin, plunging them into darkness. He pressed himself against the wall by the window, his ears straining to catch every sound. "Blackwell." A voice called from the woods. It was deep and mocking, dripping with confidence. Chase knew without a doubt it was Marcus. "You've made this more difficult than it needed to be. Come out, and we'll settle this like men." Chase didn't respond. Instead, he took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, not with Rose and Lisa depending on him. Another voice joined Marcus's, closer this time. "He's not alone. We saw the girls. Let's get this over with." The words sent a chill through Chase. They were targeting the twins, not just him. That realization spurred him into action. Moving silently, he crept toward the back of the cabin, where the shadows were deepest. From his vantage point, he saw the faint outlines of 3 figures moving through the trees. Marcus was at the center, his broad frame unmistakable. The other 2 were smaller but carried themselves with the same predatory confidence. Chase waited until they were closer, his finger hovering over the trigger. He wasn't aiming to kill, only to buy time. A sudden movement from behind the cabin made his heart stop. He turned sharply, his pulse racing, and saw Rose stepping out of the back door. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fierce. "What are you doing?" Chase hissed, his voice barely audible. "I'm not letting him take us again," she replied, her voice firm despite the tremor in it. Before Chase could stop her, she stepped into the clearing. Marcus saw her immediately, his lips curling into a predatory smile. "Rose," he called, his tone almost affectionate. "It's been a long time. You've grown up." "Stay away from us," Rose said, her voice shaking but determined. Marcus chuckled, spreading his arms as if to embrace her. "Is that any way to talk to your father?" The words hit Chase like a thunderbolt. He turned to Rose, his mind reeling. What did he just say? Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away from Marcus. "He's not my father. He's a liar." Marcus laughed again, taking a step closer. "Oh, come now. You know the truth, Rose. You've always known." Chase felt his grip on the gun tighten. The revelation was staggering, but there was no time to process it. Marcus was closing in, and Rose was in danger. Suddenly, Lisa appeared in the doorway, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Rose," she called, rubbing her eyes sleepily. Marcus's attention snapped to her, and his expression darkened. "And there's the other one," he said softly. "My girls." That was the breaking point for Chase. He stepped out of the shadows, leveling the gun at Marcus. "Stay where you are," he commanded, his voice cold and unwavering. Marcus stopped, his smile fading. "You don't have it in you, Blackwell. You're just a man who got lucky. You think you can protect them from me?" Chase didn't reply. Instead, he focused on the sound of approaching footsteps from the woods. His backup was finally here. The sudden flash of headlights and the sound of shouting startled Marcus and his men. Chase's team burst onto the scene, quickly subduing the 2 men flanking Marcus. But Marcus wasn't done. He lunged at Chase, a knife glinting in his hand. Chase sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the blade, and delivered a swift blow that sent Marcus crashing to the ground. The authorities took Marcus into custody, his face a mask of fury as he was dragged away. Rose clung to Lisa, tears streaming down her face. As the dust settled, Chase knelt beside them, his heart aching at the sight of their fear. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe now." Rose looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else. Trust. "Thank you," she whispered. But as they returned to the cabin, a nagging thought lingered in Chase's mind. Marcus's parting words had been chilling. "This isn't over, Blackwell. You don't know the whole truth." And for the first time, Chase wondered if the real danger had yet to reveal itself.